A girl vanished from her own bedroom under peculiar circumstances. Police immediately began their search and soon encountered a series of unexpected twists that no one could have anticipated. Ultimately, detectives were able to uncover the truth about her fate. However, this revelation raised even more unsettling questions. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. After her parents divorced when she was young, she moved with her mother to the small town of Stella in Missouri. Her mother, Colin, met a man named David, and they got married. Colin had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after the wedding, she and David had a daughter. In total, Rowan had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, with whom she was very close. She spent a lot of time outdoors biking around her town, and she loved to swim and draw. Additionally, Rowan enjoyed spending time at her local church's Sunday school, always one of the first to enthusiastically assist other children who were struggling with their tasks. In November 2007, the 9-year-old 4th grader often found herself alone. Her mother worked night shifts at a store, while her stepfather took care of the farm during the day. This situation made the girl independent from an early age. On November 2nd, following her usual routine, she stayed home alone. Her mother went to work, and her stepfather had not yet returned from the farm. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Callan returned from her night shift and checked Rowan's room, but she was not there. Upon asking her husband about their daughter's whereabouts, she learned that Rowan had asked for permission to spend the night at a friend's house, which was granted without specifying the friend's name. Given the small size of their town, her stepfather saw no risk in this. Nevertheless, Colin was filled with worry. She decided to visit all of Rowan's friends, which did not take long due to the town's small size. However, when all the girls claimed they hadn't seen Rowan and that she hadn't stayed over, Colin's alarm grew. After unsuccessful attempts to find her daughter by searching the entire town, Colin returned home and informed her husband that Rowan was missing. Following her daughter's disappearance, Colin insisted that David contact the authorities and report the incident. However, he convinced her that Rowan was fine and would return soon. The woman waited several hours, but when her daughter did not appear, she decided to call the police herself by dialing 911. The sheriff immediately began a search operation, starting by visiting their home to meet with David, the last person to see Rowan. David explained that on that evening, while he was working on the farm with a colleague, Christopher, another acquaintance, Nathan, stopped by. They all decided to go to David's home to drink and play pool. They picked up some alcohol and spent a few hours at home. As it got dark, Christopher and Nathan decided to go to a nearby town to Christopher's residential trailer, and David, after some hesitation, joined them. Before leaving, he checked that Rowan was asleep and then left with his friends. They stopped for more alcohol and continued the evening at Christopher's trailer. After a while, David decided to head home and asked Nathan to drive him. Choosing to avoid main roads and driven by the desire to stay out of sight of the police due to being intoxicated, Nathan took him home via back roads. Upon arriving home, David immediately went to sleep, but was soon woken by Rowan, who wanted to spend the night at a friend's house. Without hesitation, David consented and fell back asleep. The police were skeptical of this narrative, particularly questioning how a 9-year-old girl would decide to go to a friend's house in the middle of the night, and why the stepfather allowed this without even asking for the friend's name. The sheriff considered the possibility that David might be hiding something or was involved in Rowan's disappearance, though there was no concrete evidence to support this theory. That same day, police and residents of the town and its surroundings mobilized for a search, which continued into the late night. Given that Stella was a small town with only about 150 residents, news of Rowan's disappearance quickly spread among the local population. In a community where children used to freely roam the streets, the disappearance of one of their own caused shock and panic. Not finding the girl on the first day of searching, the police went to the neighboring town to Christopher, who confirmed David's version. Christopher also added that he had not had contact with his friend since that evening and was unaware of Rowan's disappearance. The same day, the police force was significantly bolstered by additional volunteers. Yet no success in finding Rowan or any clues to her whereabouts was achieved. The next morning, FBI agents joined the investigation. While local police surveyed the town and adjacent areas, FBI agents focused on the possibility of an abduction, expressing doubts about the credibility of Rowan's stepfather's account. His narrative raised questions, and confirmation of his words from the friends the girl supposedly could have visited was not obtained. Further interactions with David revealed inconsistencies and changes in his story, which only strengthened their suspicions. David provided conflicting information about the time he was away from home on the night of the disappearance, and at times suggested that Rowan could have left the house without his permission or knowledge. Additionally, FBI agents discovered that David had asked to borrow his mother's car on the night of the disappearance, a detail he initially did not share with the police. As a result, it was decided to seize and inspect both the mother's car and David's personal pickup truck. Despite a thorough inspection, experts found no evidence or traces in the vehicles. During the same period, the team of investigators decided on the appropriateness of conducting further interviews with Christopher and Nathan, considering their presence with David on the evening prior to the disappearance. The police invited Christopher to the station, where he once again confirmed his initial statements provided the day before. Moreover, Christopher agreed to voluntarily undergo a lie detector test, the results of which showed no signs of deception, after which he was released. Sometime after leaving the police station and returning to his workplace, Christopher saw Sheriff Clark's patrol car and signaled for him to stop. Sheriff Clark, who led the police department of the small town of Whiten, had known Christopher for over 17 years since his childhood. Clark maintained a warm relationship with his foster parents and was respected by Christopher, who turned to him for advice and support during tough times, such as the sudden death of his mother. Approaching Christopher, Clark listened to his account of the situation regarding Rowan's disappearance. Although the sheriff was aware of the missing girl, he had not been involved in the investigation, which was being conducted under the auspices of the Stella Department. During their conversation, Clark felt that Christopher's behavior seemed somewhat unnatural, leading him to suspect that Christopher might be withholding important information. Considering the critical importance of Rowan's life and safety, whose fate remained unclear, Clark decided to share his suspicions with the FBI agents. Speaking to the agents, the sheriff expressed his concerns about Christopher, suggesting that he might be hiding key information that could indicate Rowan's stepfather's involvement in her disappearance. Sheriff Clark speculated that David might have convinced Christopher to alter the details of his story about that night, and now Christopher feared that the truth might implicate him as an accomplice in the crime. Highlighting his deep, trust-based relationship with Christopher, Clark offered his help in persuading the man to share everything he knew. That evening, Christopher decided to visit Rowan's mother to inquire about the progress of the search in David's absence. By this time, FBI agents had arrived at the house wanting to speak again with the girl's mother. Noticing Christopher, they asked him additional questions. Christopher confirmed his previous version of events, but for the first time, expressed suspicion of David's potential guilt in Rowan's disappearance, expressing a desire to help uncover the truth in any way possible. He even offered to use a listening device in a conversation with David to elicit a possible confession, but the investigators decided to postpone the use of this method. Instead, the agents inquired with Christopher about places where, in his opinion, David might have hidden Rowan's body. Christopher suggested several potential locations that could serve as hiding spots for the body. At dawn the next day, the law enforcement team began a thorough inspection of the locations Christopher had indicated, while also continuing to patrol the area around Stella. Meanwhile, FBI agents called David in for another interrogation, where he consistently denied any accusations against him. During the search of his residence, investigators looked for any clues that could shed light on the situation, but found none. Meanwhile, Christopher visited Sheriff Clark to discuss his recent interaction with the FBI. During their conversation, the sheriff's impression that Christopher was still withholding certain details was reinforced. After this meeting, Clark again reached out to the investigators, suggesting that Christopher was hiding information critically important for proving David's guilt. FBI agents, taking into account Christopher's previous appeals to Sheriff Clark and his openness to discussing the case, suggested Clark continue attempts to have a full conversation with him, suspecting Christopher wanted to share significant information, but was hesitating for some reason. The next day, November 7th, the police invited Christopher to the station again to obtain his permission to inspect a safe located in David's house. Several months before, Christopher had temporarily lived with David and left some of his belongings there. Christopher not only consented to the safe's inspection, but also allowed his trailer and car to be checked. Moreover, he provided a DNA sample and agreed to be reinterrogated. During the interrogation, investigators revisited the events of that night, trying to clarify and confirm David's story. During this dialogue, investigators were faced with an unexpected turn of events. Christopher suddenly declared that his friend's story did not match reality, signaling the investigators to intensify the interrogation to uncover the truth. However, the increased pressure frightened Christopher. He became visibly nervous and warned that if the accusatory tone and assumptions about his involvement in the child's disappearance continued, he would refuse further communication. As a result, the interrogation was halted, and Christopher left the police building. That same evening, he visited Sheriff Clark to share his concerns about the interrogation, expressing his outrage at the investigators' suspicious behavior and contemplating the need for a lawyer. Sheriff Clark affirmed his right to legal defense, but recommended trying to understand the investigators' actions and continuing cooperation in the search for Rowan. In response, Christopher stated he no longer wished to communicate directly with the police, preferring to share information only through the sheriff. Clark insisted on the importance of disclosing all information Christopher knew. During this conversation, Christopher could not hold back tears, expressing his fondness for Rowan and assuring that he could never harm her. Living in David's house had fostered his emotional bond with Rowan and the other children, who over time came to regard him as Uncle Christopher. Sheriff Clark felt Christopher was on the verge of disclosing important information. However, their conversation was unexpectedly interrupted by visitors, which distracted Clark. At that moment, Christopher, without waiting for their conversation to resume, quietly left the sheriff's office and disappeared, not divulging the secret he was prepared to share. Sheriff Clark initiated another dialogue with FBI agents, sharing details of his last conversation with Christopher. He expressed the belief that Christopher was on the brink of revealing everything, but warned that any pressure might provoke him to completely refuse cooperation and seek legal aid. Clark suggested giving Christopher some time to reflect, to which the detectives agreed. The next day, the search for Rowan continued unsuccessfully, but the situation dramatically changed on November 9th, a week after the girl's disappearance. Search teams reached a remote area near Powell, located 16 kilometers from Stella. There, among fields and trees, they found a large natural depression. Inspecting it, the team discovered the girl's body hidden under a layer of leaves and debris at the bottom of the pit. Rowan's body was unclothed below the waist, except for one sock, and strangulation marks were observed on her neck. Medical experts confirmed the victim had been subjected to violence. Following this tragic discovery, FBI agents approached Sheriff Clark with a request to meet again with Christopher, hoping that in light of new circumstances, he would be ready to share all his knowledge about the case. On the morning of that day, Sheriff Clark received information that Christopher had visited the police station in his absence, leaving a message for him through colleagues about the need for an urgent conversation. Reacting to this message, the sheriff set out to look for Christopher, checking all possible places the man might be, but without success. The situation changed when Christopher himself contacted Clark, expressing clear concern and questioning if he was under surveillance. He explained that, shaken by the news of Rowan's body being found, he tried to calm himself by driving around town and noticed an unknown gray car following him. Sheriff Clark assured Christopher that he was unaware of any surveillance and offered to meet for a discussion. When they met, Christopher appeared extremely nervous and expressed fears for his safety, worried that he could be implicated in the crime following the discovery of Rowan's body and fearing retribution. Clark transported him back to the station, emphasizing that with the case being reclassified as a murder, it was time for Christopher to reveal everything he knew. Again, under the influence of emotions, Christopher broke down in tears. The sheriff tried to persuade him to share information about David's actions towards Rowan. However, Christopher expressed a reluctance to discuss this matter at the police station due to the presence of many people, suggesting a more secluded place for the conversation. He pointed to a small bridge located near their town. Sheriff Clark agreed to the suggestion, and they headed to the specified location to continue their conversation. After carefully parking his car, Christopher unexpectedly got out and extended his hand to the sheriff. With a mysterious voice, he said that he needed to be handcuffed. The sheriff was taken aback by such a request and responded negatively, convincing Christopher of the senselessness of such an action. But Christopher insisted, "After what I tell you, you won't be able to refuse." With these words, he began his story. First, Christopher repeated the initial part of the story he had once told the police. Together with Nate and David, they went to his trailer, where they continued to drink for some time. Later, the friends decided to go their separate ways. In turn, David asked Nate to drive him. They decided to take the back roads to avoid encountering the police and left. Then Christopher began to tell what would shock the sheriff. He claimed that that evening there was a desire to assault Rowan, and he quickly devised a plan. Knowing his friends would take a long time since the road through the fields took much more time, Christopher headed to David's house, choosing the direct route via the main highway. He entered Rowan's room, picked her up, and silently carried her out of the house so as not to wake the girl. After that, he took her to his trailer, where he committed violence against her. According to the man, she only woke up at that moment and tried to resist, but she couldn't escape. Christopher didn't turn on the light and didn't speak to her, as he didn't want her to recognize him after the incident. He planned to take her back home and leave, but things didn't go as he wanted. When he carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was bright enough for her to see his face. At that moment, Christopher panicked, grabbed a rope, and strangled the victim. After she died, he loaded her body into his car and started to think about what to do next. Initially, he wanted to drop her off the bridge, the very one he stood on with Sheriff Clark. But Christopher realized her body would be found too quickly. So he drove around the county, pondering other options. Soon, he remembered a large pit near the neighboring town and headed there. He dropped the girl's body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches. However, the pit's diameter was too large, and everything fell to the bottom. Returning to the trailer, Christopher found Rowan's bloodstains on his clothes and mattress. Moreover, he needed to dispose of her pants and underwear, as well as the rope he used to kill her. He collected all these items and put them in a large barrel, intending to burn them. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would definitely attract attention. So he dragged the barrel into a shed, closed the door, and started the fire there. Sheriff Clark was entirely unprepared for such a turn of events. Throughout the time, he believed that David committed the crime, and Christopher was only hiding some information. It was hard for the sheriff to believe that someone he had known for almost 20 years could be capable of such brutality. Christopher himself had raised 3 small children, although they did not live together after he divorced his wife. He always seemed like a reliable and decent person. However, the reality was much more tragic. After Christopher finished